Starting off, a couple of quick notes. Number one, I guess spoiler warning. In addition to Justice League, I also mentioned some narrative details from X-Men, X-Men First Class, Batman v Superman, Man of Steel, and Return of the Jedi. Personally, I don't care about that, but if you do, okay, those are the movies. Number two, I am just some idiot on the internet. I don't really know what I'm talking about. This is not a work of criticism in a real sense. I'm trying to learn by working through some ideas. I may not even agree with this in 10 minutes. Number three, I know some of the Snyder drama, but this is not really about that, except where it's directly related to this. If you want to know more about Snyder, go watch a YouTube video where someone did some actual research instead of listening to me. I talk about it here, but not much. This is moderately tightly focused on Justice League as theatrically released. Number four, there are plenty of things I did like and plenty of things I didn't like that just didn't make it in here. I do not feel the need to list them out of an abundance of fairness. I'm sure there's one or two YouTube videos about Justice League that just go through the movie in that context. Basic points. Justice League as it released in theaters is aggressively mediocre, well below the standards of the directors or most of the cast. Most of this traces to the ramifications of three different big issues. The upcoming streaming-only version of the movie won't have these specific issues in the same way, so it's likely to be a better, more interesting film. But there are a lot of red flags that suggest that Snyder's vision for Justice League, while more unified and more coherent, was still unpleasant and not super well executed, and that may be felt in the upcoming version. All right, let's go. First, the challenge of reviving Superman. Even though Film YouTube got fixated on the ongoing Superman thing, how will they revive Superman? How will they deal with his mustache? Can they make Superman likable? Superman's not actually in this movie very much as a character anyway. He's not actually necessary to the plot, the themes. There are themes, or, well, a theme, though it's a bit tough to dig out. The themes work better without him, and he has the least going on in terms of character of the main characters, and some side characters. But it's the same problem Return of the Jedi has. The last movie left Superman in a situation the audience knows he has to be rescued from. So even though that's not actually a part of this story, and even though, like Han, the whole thing works just fine if you just take him out, we have to devote enough time to rescuing him to make it satisfying. In Return of the Jedi, it's a weird, unpleasant, exploitative half hour at the start of the movie, but at least that is kind of like in Act 1. In this case, it's most of Act 2, which literally ends with the villain completing his plan because the heroes literally forgot to do anything about it because they're in the middle of the Superman resurrection. I don't think it works really at all. It's worth noting that part of the issue here, though, is a problem left by the previous movie. The obvious solution is not resurrecting Superman in this movie, letting the movie be about making do without him. Maybe just seeding a couple of elements to use resurrecting him in a future movie, but that obvious solution is clearly off limits. Second, the visual look. Something has gone wrong with the footage. I assume that something is a combination of A, large numbers of effects having to be redone on a short schedule after reshoots or being delayed while it was unclear what the new director's plan was. B, some kind of saturation up effect getting paced onto essentially finished shots with mixed results, and Whedon's footage having to be messed with to match that messy effect. And C, there being some kind of of issue with the mocap that would have needed the mocap sessions to be redone, and this not being possible given the post-reshoots time limits. It's not so bad that it's unwatchable. It's just notably below the level of fidelity and awe-inspiring grandeur that the filmmakers clearly want. Well, some scenes are kind of unwatchable. At least two scenes, one near the beginning and one in the second act, are supposed to be visually dark and instead land at soupy, like difficult to distinguish. Everyone fixated on Henry Cavill's upper lip, but worse digital effects problems surround Cyborg and Steppenwolf. Half of Cyborg's face, and for part of the movie most of his body, are digital effects, and they're occasionally a bit cartoony, but that's less of a problem than, for example, the way the real half of Ray Fisher's face sometimes looks like clay, because they've had to try, I guess, to merge his real performance, his mocap performance, the digital cyborg that goes over his mocap performance, and whatever post-production that I just talked about that they had to put on top of the whole thing. It's even worse with Steppenwolf, an entirely CGI character based on Ciarán Hinds' mocap performance, where the CGI model's face, maybe on its own or maybe buried under the lighting of the scene Steppenwolf is in, just doesn't reproduce Hinds' face, so that the obsessive, half-crazed cultist that you're told Steppenwolf is just isn't visible in the performance. And Ciarán Hinds being a very expressive performer, that's hard to track to the actor. And since Steppenwolf was redesigned when Joss Whedon was put on the project, it's easy to imagine that a lot of this traces to not having an appropriate amount of time to work on the effect compared to what the original production schedule would have been. Those aren't the only visual issues, and I'm sure you can find people talking competently about others with another quick search on YouTube, but believe it or not, I don't actually want to go on forever. This is already going to take a while. And again, the effects are generally fine to excellent. It's just that the result of this very complicated production on the digital footage is usually unpleasant to look at in a way that's not thematically useful for what Justice League is going for. Third, the big one, and I'm going to end up talking about this a bit, the brutal time constraint. At some point during production, clearly after the filming of Snyder's footage, but I don't know when after that, the expected running time was shortened from almost 3 hours to just under 2 hours, literally 1 minute under 2 hours. That seems to have been driven from a mandate from on very high, the very top level of Warner Brothers. So, pardon me, we're about to take a lengthy detour to talk about how long movies are. I'm the guy who always thinks you should edit a movie down, who thinks that, for example, you should just take the entire first 20 minutes out of Man of Steel, okay? To be honest, like the first hour of Man of Steel, and about 15 of the last 20 minutes of Man of Steel. Stop distracting me. My point is that for what Justice League needs to be relative to what other movies in its style and genre are trying to be, 120 minutes seems like an absurdly short runtime, and the process of getting the movie to that 120-minute mandate also seems to have been a problem. I'm not saying that a Justice League movie has to be long. What I'm saying is that the appropriate runtime is a function of the number of characters and relationships that have to be introduced and developed, to the complexity of the plot and subplots, what kinds of scenes and structures the genre needs you to have, and the tones and themes of the story. The target length of a solo Marvel movie is 2 hours on the nose. Think 1 to 2 main characters, extremely snappy pace, Generally a very compressed first act or an outright two-act structure, but not so rushed that there isn't time for a few prestige shots and a lot of humor. That's why this is also a great length to tell a Mission Impossible movie, or it was until Mission Impossible started to care about its multi-film narrative arc, or a great length to tell a Fast and Furious, or it was until Fast 5 came along and exactly the same thing I just said. And it's actually a great length to tell a Star Trek for basically the same reasons, even though saying that out loud is going to land me in Star Trek jail. But across studios and across directors, it's not the right length for basically any kind of genre blockbuster that's not trying to do exactly that. Marvel's team-up movies are all a lot longer than Justice League, but it's not just that. 120 minutes is shorter than any of Chris Nolan's Batman movies, shorter than any Harry Potter, shorter than any Star Wars made in the last 40 years, shorter than 3 of Daniel Craig's Bond movies, the fourth being the absurdly breakneck Quantum of Solace, and shorter than most other Bond movies too, actually. If you start to think about all of what Justice League has to be like, all of what has to happen in a movie for it to be a Justice League, and all of what Warner's and the different audiences want, and all of the expectations established by the movies right before it, this just has to kind of be a long movie. Like, this movie has to offer a thematic conclusion to a Superman trilogy for the people who liked the last 2 movies, also reframe the characters from those movies for people who didn't like the last 2 movies, add more lighthearted humor for an audience that thinks the problem has been not being Marvel enough, solve that big Superman issue that the last movie didn't handle, introduce 3 new protagonists you haven't really met yet, set up their backstories and character conflicts, get them onto a team that doesn't exist yet, including setting up their relationships with other team members, introduce and characterize a villain who, if you watched Batman v Superman in theaters, you haven't seen at all yet, and set up a platform for both more films in this series and, at the time, about a half dozen or more hoped-for solo series. All of that while, also telling a satisfying ensemble story in the epic and operatic style that Snyder set the course of these films on. So, the last superhero movie that tried to do something a lot like that is probably The Dark Knight Rises, which ran 165 minutes. Batman v Superman, which I don't much like, has 4 viewpoint pro/antagonists, several side characters who also get development, a half dozen subplots, even though most of them... Okay, we're not going to get into that. An epic, tragic tone, and the groundwork for a cinematic universe by pausing in the middle of the tension to show some YouTube clips. Not going to get into it. And I'm told it makes more sense in the 3-hour extended cut than it did in the 2.5-hour theatrical cut. To put it another way, it's not an accident that X-Men First Class, a period piece with 3 main protagonists, multiple villains with different plans, and several subplots, that also needs to explicitly set up a cinematic universe, ends up needing more scenes than X-Men, the movie actually called X-Men, a taut thriller with 2 protagonists who spend most of the film together, few subplots, and that only needs to sort of leave the way clear for a possible sequel, and so naturally comes in a half hour longer. So even if I kind of want a Justice League movie to be X-Men, both Warner's and most of the audiences want X-Men First Class, or a movie of the scope of X-Men First Class, the everything to everyone kind of movie that a 160, 170, 180-minute movie can be, but a 120-minute movie probably can't. The point of this whole digression is that it doesn't just make sense for Snyder to want Justice League to be pretty long. Warner's wanted that too, and Shirley originally planned for it. So really the only reason you would issue a dictate that it be 120 minutes or shorter is that as producers you've lost so much confidence in the film that you're willing to do lasting damage not to one project but to your entire tentpole franchise to turn this one project into the kind of rapid fire fight joke, get in, get out movie that makes a lot of noise and ends before the viewer can notice they're not having much fun. And that might be kind of a fair level of confidence to have had in the film after apparently seeing a very bad cut and coming off of the critical response to Batman v Superman, which doesn't just indict Snyder's capability, but also suggests the audience will be skeptical going into this film. But while you can do all kinds of things to a film in the edit, you're not going to be able to take a third of the planned length out without making choices. Like when I cracked that joke about Man of Steel, when I said to take the first hour and 15 of the last 20 minutes out of Man of Steel, what I was saying, which you hopefully understood as I was saying it, is that I thought the movie would be better if its scope was narrowed to not include elements that are dealt with in those sections. Justice League is a 2-hour movie that might kind of work as a 3-hour movie. To imagine what it looks like with an extra hour, I don't need to think up new subplots or complications or characters. Basically every character arc and every scene that's not the big action sequences is fairly clearly mutilated in the cut. As a result, the movie ends up trying to do all 8 of the things I mentioned before, and does them all badly. So fair warning, I'm about to make a bunch of completely unsupportable assertions. I do not know what was filmed and not put into the movie. These are my impressions based on how scenes feel, trying to make sense of character arcs and stories, and how a filmmaker, even a stylized filmmaker like Snyder, would want to tell them. The emotional crux of Justice League is the power of friendship to redeem and heal wounded individuals. By the way, I assume this is Whedon's emotional crux of Justice League, and that whatever Snyder's was has been lost, because it just seems more like a Joss Whedon crux than a Snyder crux. It's not a complex point. It's not especially deep. Could easily be the emotional crux of this year's season of Thomas and Friends without any simplification whatsoever. But since this is a movie literally about the literal Super Friends, that's fine. In fact, as a follow-up to 2 movies explicitly about isolation and the loss of camaraderie, and as a culmination of Bruce's arc such as it is in Batman v Superman, it actually makes a ton of sense. But it's hard to see that crux in the movie itself because, except for A, introducing their isolation at the start of the movie, and B, showing that they're rebuilding their lives at the end of the movie, getting from A to B is never done. The key conflict of the movie doesn't have anything to do with teamwork. Pieces where characters help each other grow that might have been longer or presented in a coherent sequence across the film. Pieces like the excellent save one person bit, or the honestly funny if painfully telegraphed Aquaman sitting on the lasso bit, are so few, so isolated, and so brief that in the moment you kind of dismiss them as throwaway jokes in between action scenes. These sequences could be written and performed to make the central themes painfully clear from 1 or 2 mentions, like Marvel movies do. Smash cut to, he may have been your father, boy, but he wasn't your daddy. But you can't reverse engineer them being that way. by editing them so they're really short and there's only a couple of them. The clearest progression of friendship in the whole movie is that at one point Cyborg won't fist bump Flash, but then at another point Cyborg will fist bump Flash. Steppenwolf is a crazed, vindictive general driven by a fanatical hatred of Earth, the only planet to ever repel him, and which stole the mother boxes, which in universe may or may not be the only ones. In the moment in which he finally faces a real challenge again, his fanatical hatred transforms into a spark of fear that he might be defeated again. And that spark of fear defeats him. Except, and here's the key part, no part of that characterization except for one gasping noise is shown in any respect other than a protagonist saying who Steppenwolf is or what he thinks and feels. I don't know, but it feels like Steppenwolf scenes were deliberately cut down to bare bones for time. Or there's Superman. An effort has been made to make Superman less joyless. He smiles some. He gets in a wisecrack or two, but why does Superman want to be friends with any of these people? Why does he think Batman deserves anything other than a punch in the face? Why does the Superman of the end of Batman v Superman, who does have character growth in that movie, but goes to his death feeling betrayed by the human race, doing what has to be done in spite of the failure of human institutions and moral frameworks, say the admittedly great, I believe in truth, but I'm also a big fan of justice. Where the movie lands is basically asking you to misremember Batman v Superman as having had more and different character and relationship beats at the end than it actually did, which, to be honest, is not the worst solution. In the theater, it probably kind of works. The result is not disastrous, but it is disorienting. Trying to understand anything from what journey the characters are on to literally what they are doing in the moment requires a level of attention that the film too often just doesn't give you time to bring to bear. It becomes, well, a film that needs you to think a lot harder about it than it deserves. And this is not the editor's fault. In fact, I think the editor probably did a pretty good job with the situation. It's the fault of a movie that is just required to be shorter than it has to be. When I see Zack Snyder making a 4-hour version of this movie, obviously, I think that's bonkers. No cinematic, dramatic movie has to be 4 hours. Even Zack Snyder's, Warner's Batman and Co. But at least making a 4-hour, straight-to-streaming, IMAX aspect ratio, optionally in black and white, the Joker's here and he's dressed like Jesus movie, is having the guts to be bonkers. To be honest, I remember when Spider-Man was shot like a horror movie, because this is a horror movie about monsters, some of whom have human personalities and some of whom are trying to do the right thing. I remember when X-Men was only barely about the X-Men and actually a tight drama focused on 2 outcasts. I remember when Unbreakable and Blade and Hellboy were what they were. And without arguing that all the movies of that time and style and framework were good, because there were a lot of stinkers, and without arguing that any specific more recent movies were bad, I get a little tired of being asked to give Marvel Studios credit for creativity when they occasionally seem to remember that genre exists. Not that movies like Marvel movies shouldn't exist, but at least that I also want to see big effects budgets and big name actors deployed in service of being bonkers. And Snyder seems like one of a handful of directors who sees modern filmmaking tools not only as a way to create higher fidelity in action scenes, higher realism of the effect in action scenes, but as a way to create powerful emotional effects in ways that weren't possible before, or that ceased to be possible as audiences learned how older effects worked. I kind of want to see that guy, the one who makes flawed movies because he is experimenting with the edges of his own skill and his craft, make a 4-hour, huge budget, big effects epic because he thinks there's something to be gained from trying. Even if we'll never see the actual quote-unquote Snyder Cut, even if we'll have to endure people claiming loudly and falsely that this 4-hour version reflects Snyder's pure original vision, I'm still kind of interested. Except. This is a partial list of some things about the movie that those 3 big issues don't cover, that bothered me and that I think probably reveal a lot about how Snyder thought about his Justice League project. 1. Ben Affleck staying in weird gravelly voice for basically the whole movie, even though it ruins some of what would be the better funny bits. 2. Some kind of disconnect between the directors and Gal Gadot about the characterization they wanted for Diana here, a characterization that's substantially different from how it is in both Wonder Woman and Man of Steel. 3. The Amazonians' costumes being just really grossly sexified. 4. Really on-the-nose pop songs getting dropped on emotional moments in a very distracting way. 5. Bruce and Diana's maybe romance being handled in a weirdly hands-off way, like as Team Dad and Team Mom. It's cool that they've got a thing, but it has to be kept at strictly a subtext level, even though these are objectively 2 of the hottest human beings on the face of the planet. 6. Lois Lane being literally just a make Superman happy button and doing literally nothing else at any point. 7. Weirdly many of the action shots consisting largely of people jumping off of one thing and landing on another thing with a loud thud. 8. I'm pretty sure there's a throwaway action shot that is literally first person from Batman's perspective as he swings from one thing to another. And I know that's weird, and I very well could be wrong, and I'm not going to check every shot in the movie to be sure. That's not all, but it's a start, right? At contextualizing Snyder's creative vision underneath the mess that Justice League became. And Snyder starts to seem like a guy who is interested in pushing and developing his filmmaking, but who narratively is still in exactly the same comfort zone he's always been in. A narrative comfort zone of fanatically patriarchal, self-consciously cynical stories obsessed with the psychology of great men disrespected by society and maybe most frustratingly, utterly convinced in spite of that they are apolitical. That kind of apolitical that lots of people are, that sees an incredibly charged worldview as merely factual, and the people who criticize it as bringing politics into the discussion. And I have no idea if Snyder has those politics, or if he doesn't have those politics and simply thinks that it's a really resonant framework to tell a story in, or if he isn't even aware of this. But which of those is true doesn't matter if they all have the same film output. And within that framework, he has made bad movies, good movies, and movies in between. There's room for variation within it. Maybe I'm wrong. I usually am. And a 4-hour, dour, sweeping tribute to manly despair, manly determination, and manly desaturation, investigating it from the perspective of a half dozen different characters in only slightly different situations, deploying all the resources of modern digital effects to seek new ways to explore these feelings, will still probably be worth talking about more than any of this has been. The end.